Well, hello and greetings. The topic I want to talk about today is on what I would call gurus. And I'd like to talk with you some about my thoughts on what I call a guru and why so many of us seem to want to follow gurus and what that means really within religions and outside of religions. So I would say, first of all, my thoughts these days on what a guru is anyone or anything we turn to for a one-stop solution to life. How to live life best. You might say how to be happiest in life, not just in the short term, but the long term, moreover. Now, there is a famous book written by Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, whereby it is spoken of that thinking is very, very important to growing rich, or as Napoleon Hill says in the back of the book, especially, growing to have what you most want in life by however you want to measure it, whether money or in terms of some other yardstick, shall we say, perhaps spirituality. But at any rate, the idea being that through thinking, perhaps, this is a critical component. Of course, I think the Western Hemisphere of the world is much more orientated toward thinking to bring happiness than is the Eastern sphere, which I believe emphasizes intuition a lot more. And many of their practitioners, whether monks or Eastern philosophers, have the favorite phrase, don't think, or don't think so much. So at any rate, I think the pursuit of a guru, so to speak, is in part a desire for many of us to get advice and to have someone to help rescue us when we get into difficult binds and painful circumstances. So you might say there are two opposites, two extremes. One being one of strong self-reliance to the extreme, whereby one specializes and emphasizes greatly thinking, or perhaps intuition, depending on what part of the world you were brought up in. And the other end of the spectrum being to do very little emphasis on thinking or intuition oneself, and to turn everything over to someone else. I suddenly think of Ralph Waldo Emerson and his essay Self-Reliance, or Henry David Thoreau, who went to Walden for 2 years to contemplate what was most important in life by eliminating as many of the superfluous distractions of life as possible, and getting very much simplistic in life to boil down what was most important. And thus both Emerson and Thoreau practicing, I believe, a combination of thinking and intuition on a spectrum way off to one end. So I think most of us, though, prefer to follow a life on the opposite end quite a bit, to have some kind of a guru. But by this, I don't just mean somebody in a white robe sitting on sitting in the lotus position telling us what to do and think. I think it can go far beyond this. But oftentimes there is a religious element involved, I think. Now I see this guru phenomenon in perhaps 3 realms, perhaps 4 realms, very common. First, the religious sphere. I read somewhere once that there are some 4,000 or 4,400 religions currently. So each head of each religion touting that they have all the answers and one simply needs to follow them, like following a recipe step by step, and they would say you will be maximally happy in life. Or, if we're not talking religions, perhaps we're talking philosophies. If we were to study philosophy in school, seeking answers to how to best be happy, there's no end to the number of philosophers who very much believe in their own point of view and want us to follow step by step again, as if cooking a very complicated recipe, perhaps even a French recipe that's quite complex. And if only we were to follow everything to the T, they try to guarantee that we would be happy. Often perhaps to their financial and emotional gain, ironically. Hence I think suddenly of Osho from the East, from India, and how at one point he had quite a number of Rolls Royces, in fact, in Oregon when he came to the United States. His point of view, philosophically, was quite lucrative to him, having worked through a number of theories in his mind, at least, through study of philosophy and teaching of it for some time in the schools in India. Now, if we're not talking religions per se, or philosophy, well, what about a third approach, therapy, or psychoanalysis? Now, psychoanalysis, perhaps having started formally with Freud, took on quite a few variations. I have a book on one of my bookshelves, for instance, that details, I believe, 23 different schools of philosophy. And by the way, that suddenly reminds me of how even in the Christian faith, as per religion, there are perhaps some 200 or more denominations. So this can get very, very complicated, can't it? Now, I personally spent some time with 2 different psychoanalysts in my 20s, and with the first one, my general impression, perhaps either during or afterward, was that it was very, very dogmatic. Or shall we say that the practitioner was very dogmatic. And by this I mean that they were promulgating as a guru a very specific set of premises that I was supposed to buy into and believe. And in fact, when I balked at believing certain things taught me or tried to be taught me, I was told I had trust issues. Very interesting. And in the case of the second analyst, this analyst said basically nothing at all, except perhaps one sentence at the end of each 45-minute session. I think this is perhaps what some analysts used to say was the ideal approach, for the analyst to be opaque, to thus allow transference to act. But again, recently I read that perhaps this can be abused, and that there can be a power imbalance. At any rate, then if an analyst is opaque, how convenient for them to occasionally tell the client or patient a tidbit of advice, steering the person as a guru of sorts toward a certain specific view, but the analyst or other revealing nothing about themselves that would make a client or patient think anything but that they're perfect. For if the analyst looks perfect and claims to have the degrees, to have been highly trained, then the client has no reason to start to doubt. They have no data to go on to feel that the guru has less than perfect status and viewpoint and omniscience, shall we say. Now, I think another approach sometimes to therapy would be for an occasional therapist to say they don't follow any one particular school, shall we say, whether it is cognitive behavioral therapy or classical Freudianism or Rogerian, but instead perhaps they will say they're an eclectic. I once saw, for instance, a therapist for a short period of time in my 20s who described themselves as an eclectic. And by that they meant that they take bits and pieces from all sorts of practitioners and perhaps from even observation in life and religions perhaps and relationships, etc., and try to weave this all into a big picture. I'm reminded, for instance, of the word from Europe, Weltanschauung, describing how a person puts together a picture of life, of reality, and calls it a Weltanschauung, a particular view. So the eclectic perhaps wants to put together their own special recipe instead of following the recipe of others. For instance, I'm trying to remember the exact title of a movie I once saw. It might have been Zoe and Me, whereby a worker in a restaurant was ordered by her boss to see an analyst. And at the end of the movie, the analyst told her, after she had grown quite a bit, that the analyst thought the best recipes in life were those that you create your own, as opposed, I would say, to following someone else's recipes, cookie-cutter fashion, whether simple or very complex. Perhaps even French recipes being very complex, for instance. This analyst also said in the movie that the best analyst is the one between your ears. How interesting. I think that's what was said at any rate. I might also say then that the flip side of being a therapist, if you will, who practices eclecticism, is to pick not only the best from here and there, but to identify at the same time the what you might call mistakes or weak points of various people too. And then kind of put this in the back of your mind that you don't want to follow these people in that respect. My own point of view being that if we were to look closely at each person around us, we could see certain limiting beliefs that various people have. Of course, in our own lives too. At one point in time, perhaps heavily emphasized in psychiatry would be the word delusions. But this word being perhaps quite toxic and demeaning, and more recent thoughts sometimes being the word limiting beliefs, or as Shin said in the 1920s, log jams. Some kind of premise in our mind causing a log jam. So, at any rate, our ability then to see these log jams, if you will, these illusions, another good word, in various people around us, each having a particular one, perhaps, or two or three. Or perhaps if they have a particular religious orientation, that having particular ones built in. And also then perhaps each of us have various drugs of choice, if you will, other than these illusions. And so I'm referring more to specific things like real drugs or alcohol, or various other diversions that distract us. And so the next question, I suppose, I asked myself a couple years ago as I walked once, was this: why have a guru? What is even the benefit of following someone else's instructions as to best be happy in life, rather than creating our own recipes or trying to have an amalgam of the two, where we get some advice, either in person or from books that have been written by people, versus solely going by our own observations and intuition and thinking and logic in general. Why then have such a strong emphasis in one direction to follow dogma or the cookie-cutter solutions from some others? Well, the thought has struck me that one big plus to having a guru is that it's a lot easier. And if and when life doesn't turn out so well following the guru, we can simply blame the guru as a fraud and look for a new guru, which then is, I might say, how convenient for us, because then we don't have to kick ourselves in the pants, so to speak, and say, with any sense of shame or guilt or regret, that we made a mistake, if you will, and take responsibility for it. We can simply blame the guru and move on to the next guru, and then the next, and the next. I have a friend, for instance, a very close, in high school, a close friend, who has shifted from one religious guru to another, in the sense that he started off in one faith and then switched to another and yet another and another, and perhaps went through at least 5 very, very, very different faiths, to the present faith being no faith at all, in terms of considering almost everybody a fraud, if you will, and just sitting at home and going to no church and following nobody. This perhaps being, you might say, ideally a reversion to the opposite extreme of self-reliance, only in this person's life I think that they are simply at a point where they've given up on life, and not even relying on themselves, but just simply exclaiming that life is unfathomable, and waiting for the end, so to speak, to bring release from pain. Now, I suppose, too, our original gurus, if we had one, were our parents, and so this brings up the topic, too, that I've thought of sometimes, that if our parents acted as strong gurus, trying to inculcate us with the best way of life, as opposed to allowing us some or more freedom to figure things out for ourselves, in self-reliance fashion, then some of these guru-type parents are of the type to punish us or otherwise make life very difficult, painful for us if we don't follow everything they say to the letter. And I think one reason for this is because if a child starts to question what their guru parent is saying, the parent then isn't going to get validation on their particular points of view, and this can be quite consternating if these aspects are what you might call illusions or delusions or log jams or other terms like limiting beliefs. And so our original gurus, being parents, have a lot more muscle, if you will, a lot more leverage, and get very consternated, perhaps, if we don't follow their advice, their dogma, if we don't follow this guru. And thus this sets a precedence where later in life, out of the nest, so to speak, we may be very fearful to disagree with other gurus all around us, thinking perhaps, and erroneously, that other gurus, not our parents, have just as much leverage to muck up our lives, if you will, if we don't follow them. When in fact, I think this often is not the case, because our parents generally had much more powerful influences over us than anyone else can as an adult. But once the mold is set, the pattern, it can be quite difficult to break. Just like the image of a elephant tied to a stake with a string, where it has been trained first with a heavy rope not to escape, and then later, when a simple string is attached, the elephant can't discern that the constraints are much less powerful. You might say that the parents are no longer constraining the elephant, but someone much less powerful out there in society. Now, I think, unfortunately, that it is also much easier to follow instructions or have a guru, if you will, whether we're talking religion or philosophical viewpoints or some therapeutic therapy view, or even analysis, much more in the past, or even a emphasis on psychiatric drugs as the answer. At any rate, all of this being much easier to follow if we're short on certain resources to do much more the opposite, self-reliance, and this particularly involving observation and thinking, and a combination of that where one observes and then thinks, and perhaps discusses with friends. But unfortunately, there being the necessity of time and a certain level of non-stressed living to accomplish this. For if we don't have the time, we can't really observe and ponder and discuss with our friends and relatives and spouses and even children, perhaps, or our elders. For instance, 100, 200 years ago and before, in areas where there were lots of Native American Indians or Aborigines, there was much discussion between younger people and the elders in lodges or other. But in urban life today, or fast-paced life in general, it's much easier to simply follow instructions with a guru telling us what to do if you have very little time and you're very stressed out. So then I suppose the next question would be, why do we have so little time in vast sectors of our lives, vast sectors of the world today? And why do we feel so much pressure? And thus it being so difficult to bring ourselves to observe and to apply logic to what we've observed and discuss it and further write it down and review. Why is there such a problem? Well, I suppose it boils down to sometimes a matter of scarce resources and what it takes to get them then. It can take a lot of time and a lot of heartache. For scarce resources are part and parcel of overpopulation, I think. There's only so much land to go around, for instance. This being perhaps in my mind the greatest scarcity of resources other than highly qualified medical care and highly qualified teachers too. So if there's a shortage of land, for instance, I think we'll find that there's a shortage of housing. Whether real, in fact, or artificially created to benefit certain people in certain ways. But at any rate, that good housing, as I've thought for several years now, is often in short supply. And then if we have poor housing, this can cause all sorts of emotional distresses. And furthermore, if we're looking for good housing, that we may have to work many hours each day to get it if we haven't inherited it. Or, as a third alternative, if we haven't stolen it, let's say, or enslaved other people to get it. And another factor, too, I see in modern days is what I'm reminded of by the title of a book I once bought, Data Smog. I'm also reminded of the phrase said by someone or another, it could have been Seth Godin, a marketer, that one problem we have in the modern age is that everybody owns a microphone. You might also say that it's so easy to publish independently now with Amazon or other that everybody has a pen and a typewriter and a publishing house at their fingertips and at very little cost too. And of course, there are millions and millions of ministers and millions of advisors in the shall we say, emotional department called therapists or psychiatrists. So you might say there's millions of therapists, millions of self-help books, and I call all this data smog then. Well, the opposite, perhaps, I would say, would be a strong emphasis on observation, as put forth perhaps by Russell Conwell, a lawyer perhaps 100 years ago, newspaper man, military man, and founder of Temple University, who wrote a book, Every Man His Own University, where he heavily emphasized observation rather than books or too much reading. I'm also reminded of Abraham Lincoln, who read very little other than the Bible and Blackwell's commentary in particular. And he is often having to spend many hours walking simply to get a hold of certain law books to read. Spending much more time then, I would say, observing and pondering it, and writing down what he has observed and pondered and figured out, and then reviewing it. Now to get back to this topic too of so many of us these days having to put in an inordinate amount of time and stressful work pursuing decent housing. This brings up the topic in my mind of the pursuit by many of us for security, or what I might call control, status, or what I might call elevating one's level of importance and putting down others' level of importance. And finally, heavy emphasis on obtaining distractions. You might say adult toys, or if you were to consider how children love to play in parks and ride or be on swings and have fun in amusement parks on merry-go-rounds, that many adults have their own toys and their own play swings and their own merry-go-rounds. Only they're more costly and more sophisticated, more complex. I'm reminded, for instance, of a movie I once saw of babies in various parts of the world. And the one perhaps toy that a young baby might have in Africa was a corn cob or some small object. But the play toys of a baby shown in the movie in San Francisco were numerous and very complex. So I'm reminded then that at the adult level we live at the same spectrum, perhaps. Some wanting simple toys and others wanting expensive and sophisticated ones that have to be changed out too very, very frequently due to boredom. So I guess what I'm getting at, or the upshot being that some of us, perhaps the majority these days in the world, or increasingly so, wish to have not just good housing, but security, status, and a lot of distractions. And this good housing sometimes being defined as a means of obtaining security and status and distractions. For instance, if we were to live in an urban area, a home might cost at least $300,000, $400,000 or more, and be quite large and look quite sophisticated and prim and proper. Whereas some people I've observed living in Appalachia have very simple homes, and sometimes by some standards outside of Appalachia called ramshackled or disheveled, if you will. I've seen perhaps sometimes a mobile home in Appalachia with moss growing on it, or otherwise looking in not pristine condition. And this not being a matter of concern to zoning officials in Appalachia, but being a great concern in urban areas, perhaps. But this mobile home with moss growing on it costing a huge fraction of a cost of a home in an urban area, especially in certain neighborhoods. And then the whole orientation being one more on wanting to have time, perhaps simply to indulge in pleasure, but also to grow, versus living in an urban area and spending an immense amount of time for one's housing, but then having no time to grow. And when stressed out after work, coming home and having to indulge in alcohol and drugs and numbing TV shows until we go to bed and do it all over the next day after 5 hours average consumption of TV being what it is in America. Now, I would kind of digress, too, and say that a reason why many of us these days don't wish to break away from the guru mentality and create our own recipes in life is because it takes a certain amount of intellect to do so. And sadly, what schooling we're getting these days is very well recognized by most as subpar compared to the past, wherein many people these days are passed along from grade to grade without acquiring any skills whatsoever, particularly in the fundamentals, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and with emphasis on higher mathematics too for quality thinking. I once watched a video a couple years ago by a man who lectures at the University of Chicago at the graduate level towards graduate students, emphasizing writing is very, very important for developing your thinking your positions on life. But sadly, I think people today are being able to write less and less effectively. And not mentioned by many, in my own opinion, is that it's not enough just to be a good writer, but a good discerner of the best vocabulary words to use, too. So perhaps words themselves having great power, or the wrong words used conferring us low power. For the words are the symbols by which we piece together a perspective on reality, I think. Just like in mathematics, there are various concepts and symbols to do so mathematically. But if we're not educated either by our parents or some other sphere as to the best words to use, then this alone will constrain us, let alone a poor emphasis on writing skills in general. And sadly, too, I've seen instances, not very well explained, but where sometimes people are passed along from grade to grade, lest the teacher or professor be accused of something that would cause them to lose their career. And so then it being very much a matter of pressure on professors especially to give straight A's, so the students can go on to graduate school perhaps, in the best graduate schools, not mucked up by a bad grade on their record. And thus there being much less need to develop your own thinking and quality thinking if one can skate by knowing one can pressure a professor to give out straight A grades, lest the professor be cornered and lose their career and profession, in fact. But of course, too, simply writing and thinking, in my mind, not being sufficient, but note-taking followed by reviewing. For instance, a personal story I can relate back to my time in my 20s is that when I was in my first, quote, big job, I took many, many notes based on observations, but when my work quality wasn't very good, one of my bosses said, well, note-taking isn't enough, you have to review your notes. But unfortunately, I think especially at the university level, for those who go through university, there is no emphasis on review. Especially if the student wants to get good grades to move on in life to the graduate level, they want good grades, not what has been retained. And how do you retain without reviewing? So there's a big bind right here. Not only do professors feel pushed to give good grades, but the students feel pushed to get good grades lest they not get into the best graduate programs, and then suffer economically as a result, and status-wise too. And of course, this being a detriment to whom they are able to secure as mates too. An example I can give of my best friend from high school, who never went to college, is that the secret to his great memory was that he reviewed, and reviewed a lot. His form of review was to repeat something at least 20 times, I think he told me. So the general concept being that he had come to believe that unless you review, and review a lot, you're certainly not going to remember much a few weeks later. And then what would be the point of, quote, learning something and then having it evaporate very soon afterward? Now, there are some who would say the modern age is configured to know where to find the information and review it quickly in one's mind when one needs it. But some have said that's not quite enough, and we need a certain stockroom of facts and figures to maneuver with and live life. And I suppose to build our own view on life, our Weltanschauung again. And indeed, how can we even remember what our Weltanschauung is unless we review that from time to time? Emphasize or recap what I've been talking about, my observations, ponderings, musings on this topic of gurus, is that many of us today, or throughout life, have wanted a guru, and sometimes even in the past it being forced on us, in adulthood, not just childhood, by certain parents of ours. But one spectrum end being to have someone tell us exactly what to do, and we do it. The other end of the spectrum being extreme self-reliance and listening to nobody, ever. Reading no books, in fact. Or just one book. Or just listening to one source in general. Ourselves. But then this, of course, can be problematic for if our self-reliance is based solely on intuition, one could sort of go off the deep end and invent another religion yet, created by ourselves, based on some misconception that we, for whatever reasons, never end up purging and correcting or outgrowing. So I would say that it suddenly comes to mind that many of our gurus these days, if not in the form of religions or philosophies of life, or some therapeutic approach by a psychologist or psychiatrist in the West anyway, or Buddhist monk practitioner in the East, say, is to watch talk show hosts, for instance, or leading YouTube practitioners telling us what we should think. And I would call these two gurus. One might even call some very, very famous talk show hosts who have been on for 30 years a guru. And that sadly, the more populated our world becomes, the more we have to struggle to get our basic needs met. And that means more and more time devoted to that, and more emotional strife. And then coming home and not being able to make use of what time we do have because we're so stressed out that we just sit in front of the TV and open a six-pack and zone out. Let alone use of marijuana or other drugs of choice of a chemical nature. And such that, for instance, Sadhguru, the great guru from the East these days, has said that India, amongst other countries, surprisingly, has been inundated over the past 10 or 20 years with various new or much more emphasized use of drugs of choice, to include even alcohol and marijuana. But basically what I'm referring to then is that the more we have to fight to get our basic needs met, the less time we have for observing and pondering and writing and reviewing and discussing with others, particularly friends and elders. And so I see this as the path of the world these days, and there being just more and more only pockets within each society where the emphasis is much more on observation than not. I hope this is, while quite complex and full of details, of value to you. And, this is subject to change in my own mind, but I've been musing upon these ideas for several years now, and I just put this out on the table for thought, and I hope it's useful. Take what you will and chuck the rest, so to speak. Don't consider me a guru, because I could wake up 5 years from now and say that I've had a very, very profound limiting belief that I've promulgated in this particular talk. So again, I wish you well. Have a good day.